Jonathan Pierce, a lonely and widowed millionaire, decides to participate in a community service event on New Year's Eve and unexpectedly falls in love with Claire Evans, a homeless woman. But when the clock strikes midnight, will their chance encounter turn into a new beginning, or will the past pull them apart forever? Before we continue, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching the video from. And don't forget to subscribe. In the heart of a sprawling mansion, Jonathan found himself enveloped in an unsettling silence that seemed to echo the absence of the love he had once known. The grand halls, adorned with opulent chandeliers and polished marble floors, stood as monuments to a life that felt increasingly foreign. As the clock ticked down to midnight on New Year's Eve, Jonathan wandered through the vast rooms, each step heavy with memories of laughter and warmth that had once filled these spaces. His late wife, Margaret, had infused the mansion with life, her laughter bouncing off the walls, her spirit illuminating even the darkest corners. Now, it felt like a tomb, a gilded cage where every shadow whispered her name. The walls that once bore witness to their shared dreams and aspirations now closed in on him, amplifying the weight of his solitude. Jonathan paused in front of a large portrait of Margaret, who smiled radiantly back at him, her eyes sparkling with a vitality that seemed to reach out and caress his sorrowful heart. He could almost hear her voice, full of encouragement, urging him to embrace life again. Yet, the pain of her loss had become a constant companion, a ghost that lingered in every room, in every breath he took. The new year, a time often associated with hope and renewal, felt like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. As the minutes dragged on, Jonathan felt a wave of restlessness wash over him. He had spent countless nights in this mansion, drowning in his grief, yet tonight felt different. The anticipation of the new year loomed over him like a storm cloud, and he could no longer bear the suffocating confines of his solitude. After a night of tossing and turning, plagued by dreams of a life he could no longer have, he resolved to take action. He needed to escape the mansion, to break free from the memories that clung to him like cobwebs. With a newfound purpose, he dressed in a tailored suit, the fabric smooth against his skin, yet it felt like a costume that masked the turmoil within. He stepped outside, greeted by the crisp night air that stung his cheeks and cleared his mind. The world beyond his mansion was alive with the sounds of celebration, laughter spilling into the streets as people prepared to usher in the new year. Jonathan, however, felt like a ghost wandering through a vibrant party, invisible to the joy around him. As he walked through the quiet streets, a flicker of hope ignited within him. He recalled a community service event mentioned in a flyer he had seen earlier that week, an opportunity to help those less fortunate. Volunteering at a local shelter seemed like the perfect distraction, a way to channel his sorrow into something meaningful. The thought of helping others, of making a small difference in their lives, felt like a balm for his aching heart. It was a chance to step outside of himself, to connect with the world again. Arriving at the shelter, Jonathan was struck by the warmth emanating from within. The air was filled with the scent of simmering stew and freshly baked bread, a stark contrast to the coldness he had experienced in his own home. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with activity as volunteers of all ages moved about, setting tables and preparing for the evening's meal. Jonathan's heart swelled with a sense of purpose as he approached the registration desk, ready to lend a hand. As he joined the ranks of volunteers, Jonathan observed the diverse group around him. There were teenagers laughing and joking as they folded napkins, middle-aged men and women carrying trays laden with food, and elderly volunteers sharing stories of past New Year's celebrations. Despite the differences in their backgrounds, there was a palpable sense of camaraderie, a shared mission that bound them together. Amidst the bustling crowd, Jonathan's gaze fell upon a woman serving food with an air of quiet strength. Clara was her name, as he would later learn. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room, her demeanor both cautious and resolute. There was something about her that drew him in, a resilience that resonated deep within him. Her clothes were worn, hinting at a life lived on the margins, yet she carried herself with an elegance that spoke volumes of her spirit. When their eyes met briefly, Jonathan felt an electric jolt, a connection that transcended the chaos of the shelter. But just as quickly as their gazes locked, Clara's eyes darted away, and she resumed her work with a deftness that belied her uncertainty. Jonathan sensed her wariness, the instinctive caution that came from a life of hardships. He understood it all too well. He had worn that same armor after losing Margaret. As the evening wore on, Jonathan engaged with other volunteers, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. He watched her from a distance as she interacted with the guests, her smile genuine, yet tinged with a hint of sorrow that lingered in her eyes. There was a story behind that smile, a narrative etched in the lines of her face that told of loss and survival. Jonathan felt a pull towards her, an unexplainable desire to understand the woman behind the facade of strength. The clock continued its relentless march toward midnight, and with each passing moment, Jonathan felt a sense of urgency building within him. He wanted to bridge the chasm that separated them, to reach out and offer not just his help but an understanding that came from shared pain. But as he approached Clara, a surge of hesitation gripped him. He sensed the wall she had built around herself, the shield she carried to protect her heart. Would she let him in? Would she allow him to see the vulnerabilities hidden beneath her resilient exterior? As the final moments of the year slipped away, Jonathan stood at the threshold of a new beginning, both hopeful and apprehensive. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the possibility of connection, of forging a bond with Clara, ignited a spark within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, this new year could herald a renewal not just for him, but for her as well. In that crowded shelter, surrounded by laughter and the mingled scent of food and hope, Jonathan took a deep breath, ready to step forward into the unknown, eager to discover the story of the woman who had unwittingly captured his heart amidst the chaos of life. The night was alive with promise, and as the countdown began, he felt a sense of anticipation swell within him. With the world on the brink of change, he was determined to embrace whatever lay ahead, even if it meant confronting the depths of their intertwined fates. As the bustling activity in the shelter continued, Clara stood by the large metal pots filled with steaming soup, her hands gloved against the heat. The rich aroma wafted through the air, drawing in guests with the promise of warmth and nourishment. Jonathan was nearby, ladling portions into bowls with a practiced ease, his tailored suit starkly contrasting against the humble surroundings. Clara had initially found it difficult to reconcile his polished appearance with his decision to volunteer, but as they worked side by side, she began to see a different side of him. Their interactions were tentative at first, marked by a delicate balance of curiosity and hesitation. Clara caught Jonathan's stealing glances at her, an expression of genuine interest softening his usually stoic features. There was something about the way he focused on each bowl he served, as if the act of giving was a salve for both their souls. Clara found herself drawn to his intensity, the way he seemed to pour not just soup, but also a piece of himself into each serving. The shelter was alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter, the clattering of dishes punctuating the air. Volunteers moved with a sense of purpose, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that their efforts were making a difference. Yet, amidst the chaos, Clara felt a strange calmness when she was near Jonathan. He was not just a wealthy man. He was someone who had stepped into her world, if only for this evening. As the night wore on and the guests filled the tables, Clara and Jonathan found themselves in a rhythm. They exchanged light banter, their conversations peppered with playful jabs and laughter, creating a bubble of warmth in the otherwise chilly environment. Clara admired Jonathan's ability to connect with the guests, his genuine concern evident in his interactions. He listened intently, offering kind words and encouragement as he moved from table to table. Clara's heart swelled with an unfamiliar sense of hope. In the moments they shared, she sensed a connection forming, a fragile thread woven between their disparate lives. Yet, beneath that emerging bond lay the weight of her past, the haunting memories of loss that she carried like a shadow. Jonathan was a beacon of light, but she was terrified of letting him in too deeply, afraid that her darkness would extinguish his glow. During a brief lull in their duties, Clara stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The cool night enveloped her, a stark contrast to the warmth of the shelter. She leaned against the cool metal railing, her thoughts swirling like the snowflakes that began to fall gently from the sky. She recalled the chaotic night that had changed her life forever, the shrieks of tires on pavement, the devastating silence that followed. It was a night etched in her memory, a night that had taken her family from her and left her wandering through life like a ghost. Jonathan soon joined her, his presence a comforting warmth against the cold. He stood beside her, looking out into the night, the twinkling city lights reflecting in his deep-set eyes. Clara felt the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between them, waiting to be voiced. She turned to him, searching for a glimpse of understanding in his gaze. His voice was soft, almost reverent, as he spoke of the new year and its promise. While others around them celebrated with joy, Clara felt an ache in her heart. The holiday was a stark reminder of what she had lost, a time that should have been filled with laughter echoing through her home, now replaced with an empty silence. Jonathan, sensing her turmoil, looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She hesitated, unsure of how to share her pain without risking the fragile connection they were building. It was easier to remain the strong, resilient woman she had become in the wake of her tragedy, but the warmth emanating from Jonathan's presence made her want to break free from the chains of her past. She wanted to confide in him, to let him see the truths hidden beneath her facade. As the clock moved closer to midnight, the atmosphere within the shelter grew electric with excitement. The volunteers gathered together, laughter ringing out as they shared stories and toasted to new beginnings. Clara watched Jonathan as he animatedly engaged with others, his laughter infectious. There was a magnetic pull between them, an unspoken understanding that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. When the final countdown began, Clara felt her heart race. She was caught between the urge to flee from the vulnerability of the moment and the desire to remain close to Jonathan. As the seconds ticked away, she found herself drawn to him, unable to resist the urge to bridge the gap that had formed between them. In the chaos of the celebration, time seemed to slow down. As the final seconds approached, Clara stood close to Jonathan, her breath hitching in her throat. When the clock struck midnight, a wave of joy erupted around them, but all she could focus on was the man beside her. His gaze locked onto hers, and in that instant, everything else faded away. The moment felt monumental, charged with an energy that neither of them had anticipated. Clara felt the world around her dissolve as Jonathan leaned in, his lips brushing against hers with a tenderness that took her breath away. It was a kiss that spoke of unspoken promises, of hope and healing, and in it, Clara felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever. As they pulled away, reality rushed back in, but the warmth of the kiss lingered on her lips, igniting a spark within her. She saw the vulnerability in Jonathan's eyes, a reflection of her own emotions swirling within. They were two souls navigating the aftermath of loss, finding solace in one another amidst the chaos of their realities. In that fleeting moment, Clara realized that she was no longer alone. Jonathan had stepped into her life, offering a glimpse of a future that felt almost impossible just moments before. Their shared experiences had forged a bond that transcended their circumstances, and as the shelter filled with the sounds of celebration, Clara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. As Jonathan pulled away from the kiss, a rush of warmth coursed through him, igniting a flurry of emotions that he had long buried beneath layers of grief and solitude. The contact had been brief yet electrifying, and the taste of Clara's lips lingered, stirring feelings he thought were lost forever. He stood in the dim light of the shelter, surrounded by the remnants of a fleeting celebration, heart pounding at the realization that this moment would change everything. Yet, as the initial thrill settled, doubt began to creep in. Jonathan's thoughts spiraled back to the life he had built around his late wife, a life filled with love, laughter, and a future that had been cruelly snatched away. He remembered the promise he made to her on her deathbed, vowing to cherish their memories and to remain steadfast in his commitment to her. The guilt washed over him, mingling with the burgeoning affection he felt for Clara. She was a beacon of hope, yet he feared that embracing this new connection would feel like betrayal. Across the room, Clara's reaction mirrored his turmoil. Her heart raced, but it was with trepidation rather than excitement. The kiss had awakened something deep within her, a flicker of hope that had been extinguished after the tragic loss of her family. It was a reminder of what she had desperately sought to protect herself against: vulnerability. She had spent so long erecting walls to shield herself from further pain, and now, in a moment of weakness, she had let them down. The warmth of Jonathan's lips ignited a longing for connection, but it also brought forth a wave of anxiety. Could she allow herself to love again? With every heartbeat, she felt the weight of her past pressing against her chest, stifling her ability to breathe freely. In a sudden rush of instinct, Clara stepped back, her gaze dropping to the floor as she wrestled with her emotions. The world around them faded, the chatter of other volunteers and the clatter of plates becoming a distant echo. Jonathan's confusion was palpable as he watched her retreat. He felt a knot tightening in his stomach, a raw ache that echoed the loneliness he had known for so long. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance she had created, but he didn't know how. Words failed him, and in that moment, silence stretched uncomfortably between them. Clara turned away, deliberately putting space between them, as if the act could erase the connection they had just forged. She felt the sting of tears forming at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them away, unwilling to let her vulnerability surface. She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture against the emotional turmoil swirling inside her. The shadows of her past loomed large, and she feared that allowing Jonathan into her heart would only lead to more suffering. Jonathan stood frozen, the warmth of the kiss fading into the chill of uncertainty. He felt as if he were standing on the precipice of something beautiful, yet terrifying. The ache in his chest intensified as he watched Clara's retreating figure, the soft glow of the shelter lights casting a halo around her. He wanted to understand her, to unravel the layers that shrouded her heart. But how could he when she seemed so determined to keep him at arm's length? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he grappled with the thought that perhaps he was not the man she needed. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the anticipation of a new year filled the air, but for Jonathan, the moment felt hollow. The joyous celebration around him faded into a distant murmur. He felt an overwhelming urge to chase after Clara, to find the words that would convince her to stay, yet he remained rooted in place, paralyzed by the fear of rejection. The laughter of volunteers and the clinking of glasses felt like a mocking reminder of the happiness he once knew, now eclipsed by the shadows of his past. The countdown began, and the shelter filled with excited chatter, yet Jonathan's heart thundered in a different rhythm. Each cheer felt like a reminder of the connection slipping through his fingers. Clara stood at the edge of the room, her back turned to him, lost in her thoughts. In that moment, all he could think about was the resolution he needed to make. He needed to find her, to understand her better, and to show her that he was not a threat to her heart, but a refuge from the storm that life had dealt her. As the clock struck midnight, fireworks erupted outside, illuminating the night sky with bursts of color. The jubilant voices of volunteers rang out, welcoming the new year with hope and joy. Jonathan felt the warmth of the celebration wash over him, yet his heart ached for the woman who had slipped away. He glanced towards Clara, who remained withdrawn, her expression unreadable. The spark of a new beginning flickered in his chest, a determination brewing within him to not let this moment, this connection, disappear into the ether. With every fiber of his being, Jonathan resolved to pursue Clara, to unravel the barriers she had built around herself. He envisioned a future where they could face their pasts together, where love could blossom amidst the ruins of their tragedies. He knew it would not be easy. Her scars ran deep, and the shadows of her past held a tight grip on her heart. But he believed that together they could forge a path toward healing, a journey that would transform their pain into strength. As the night wore on and the celebrations continued, Jonathan made his way through the crowd, his heart set on finding Clara once more. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, yet there was a lightness in his step, a flicker of hope that had ignited within him. The laughter and cheers around him became a backdrop to the singular purpose that now consumed him. He would not allow fear or sorrow to dictate their fate any longer. It was time to break through the barriers, to show Clara that love could be a safe haven rather than a source of pain. Jonathan scanned the room, searching for her familiar silhouette among the throng of volunteers. He felt a sense of urgency, as if time itself was slipping away. He needed to act before she disappeared entirely, lost in the shadows of her thoughts. The resolve hardened within him. This was not merely about him. It was about Clara, about the possibility of a future that lay ahead if only he could reach her. Finally, he spotted her near the far wall, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the shelter lights. She was lost in contemplation, the world around her fading into a blur. Jonathan's heart raced as he approached, each step echoing the weight of his determination. He would not let this connection slip away. He would not let fear dictate the course of their lives. With every ounce of courage he could muster, he moved closer, ready to embrace whatever awaited him. Jonathan spent the next few days engulfed in a search for Clara, a quest that filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Each morning, he would rise early, his mind racing with thoughts of her, replaying their brief yet profound moments together. He dressed meticulously in his tailored suits, the fabric crisp against his skin, a stark contrast to the world he was now trying to enter. The world of the homeless, a world where appearances mattered little, but kindness weighed heavily. He returned to the shelter, the vibrant buzz of activity contrasting sharply with the quiet of his mansion. The shelter was alive with laughter and chatter, the air thick with the aroma of hearty soup and freshly baked bread. Jonathan moved through the crowd, stopping to speak with fellow volunteers, his heart racing at the thought of encountering Clara again. He asked about her, his voice steady despite the anxiety knotted in his stomach. Each time a volunteer mentioned her, he felt a flicker of hope. As days turned into a week, he learned more about Clara's life. The stories painted a picture of resilience. They spoke of her courage in the face of overwhelming adversity, of her ability to find light even in the darkest corners of her existence. Jonathan felt a deep admiration for her, an admiration that grew with each passing moment. Her pain resonated with him on a personal level, and he could not shake the feeling that their lives were intertwined by more than just chance. One afternoon, while volunteering at the shelter, Jonathan caught sight of her silhouette in the distance. Clara was sitting on a bench outside, her head slightly bowed, lost in thought. The sun cast a warm glow on her hair, and for a moment, he was captivated by the serene beauty that emanated from her. He approached cautiously, careful to respect the space she seemed to need. His heart pounded in his chest as he contemplated how to bridge the gap between them. Clara sensed his presence before she looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to a guarded wariness. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a wall of uncertainty. Jonathan felt the air grow thick with tension, and he understood that she was still grappling with her emotions. Her fears of vulnerability were palpable. He sat down beside her, the bench creaking under their combined weight. Jonathan took a moment to gather his thoughts, searching for the right words that would reach her heart. He wanted her to understand that he was not just a wealthy man looking for a fleeting connection. He was a man who had endured loss and understood the weight of grief. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions. Clara turned her gaze to the ground, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her worn jacket. Jonathan could see the way her shoulders tensed, the way her breath quickened. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he feared that any sudden movement might send her retreating once more. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice low and steady, hoping to break through the walls she had built around herself. Days passed, and each day he returned to the shelter, hoping to see her, hoping to connect. He would help serve meals, engage with the other volunteers, and whenever he could, he would steal glances in Clara's direction, hoping to catch her eye. But she remained elusive, a ghost in the vibrant world around him. Jonathan's heart sank with each failed attempt to reach her. Finally, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange hue across the sky, Jonathan found Clara sitting alone at a table. She was sketching absent-mindedly in a worn notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. He approached slowly, his heart racing with anticipation. This time, she didn't flinch when he sat down across from her. Instead, She glanced up and held his gaze for a fleeting moment before looking back at her drawing. Jonathan felt a surge of determination. He wanted to show her that he understood her pain and that it was okay to let him in. He reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing against the edge of the page. Clara looked up sharply, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of defiance. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, not wanting to startle her. She hesitated for a moment, her expression softening. Clara's defenses began to lower, if only slightly. Jonathan took a deep breath, allowing the silence to settle between them as he contemplated the right approach. He wanted to share his own story, to reveal the depths of his sorrow and the journey he had undertaken since losing his wife. He hoped that by opening up, he could create a safe space for her to do the same. As he began to share his tale, Clara listened intently, her eyes reflecting a myriad of emotions. He spoke of the love he had lost, of the void that had consumed him after her death. Jonathan described the endless nights filled with haunting memories, the way he would wander through the empty hallways of his mansion, feeling the weight of solitude pressing down on him. He let his vulnerability shine through, hoping that it would resonate with her. Clara's expression shifted as he spoke, her features softening. She seemed to grapple with the revelation that he, too, had known profound loss. There was a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a spark that hinted at the possibility of connection. Jonathan could see the walls she had built beginning to crack, and he felt a surge of hope. After he finished, a comfortable silence enveloped them. Clara looked down at her sketchbook, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as if searching for the right words to say. The vulnerability in the air was palpable, and Jonathan could feel the tension ebbing away. Slowly, Clara began to share her own story, the loss of her family in that tragic accident. Her voice quivered as she recounted the moment it all changed, the day her life spiraled into chaos. Jonathan listened intently, his heart aching for her as she spoke of the loneliness that followed, the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. They shared a moment of raw honesty, a connection forged in grief and understanding. As the evening deepened, the shelter around them buzzed with activity, but for Jonathan and Clara, time felt suspended. In that intimate bubble, they found solace in one another's tales of heartache and survival. Jonathan began to see Clara not just as a homeless woman, but as a kindred spirit who had fought valiantly against the tides of misfortune. Tears glistened in Clara's eyes as she spoke, and Jonathan felt an overwhelming desire to comfort her, to wipe away the remnants of pain that lingered in her gaze. He reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers, a silent promise that he would stand by her side as she navigated the tumultuous waters of her past. Clara looked up, surprise etched across her features, but instead of pulling away, she allowed him to hold her hand, if only for a moment. In that fleeting touch, something transformative occurred. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable began to dissolve. Clara's heart, once encased in layers of fear and doubt, began to open, revealing the possibility of a future not defined by loss, but by the potential for love and companionship. As the night wore on, Jonathan and Clara shared laughter and stories, their connection deepening with each passing moment. Jonathan felt a warmth blooming within him, a flicker of hope that perhaps, together, they could create something beautiful from the ashes of their pasts. The world around them continued to bustle with life, but for Jonathan and Clara, they had stepped into a realm where healing and understanding intertwined. They were no longer just two souls adrift in their own sorrow. They were two hearts finding comfort in the shared struggle of life. The stars began to twinkle above, and as Jonathan looked into Clara's eyes, he realized that this was just the beginning of their journey together. A journey that promised to redefine their futures, drawing them closer to the love they both desperately craved. As their relationship blossomed, Clara felt a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation. She had always been a protector of her heart, shielding it from the harsh realities that life had dealt her. Yet, with Jonathan, there was an undeniable warmth that beckoned her to step into the light. She wanted to share the world she had come to know, the community that had embraced her, and the streets that had become both a refuge and a battleground. One crisp afternoon, Clara led Jonathan through the winding alleys of the neighborhood she called home. The sun filtered through the buildings, casting a golden hue over the faded murals and vibrant street art that told the stories of the people living there. Each wall bore witness to struggles, triumphs, and resilience. And Clara felt a swell of pride as she pointed out the various landmarks that had shaped her life. The atmosphere in the city had shifted with the new year, leaving behind the remnants of hope and despair that had marked the past. As the news of Clara's past began to circulate, Jonathan felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. The weight of the scandal created a palpable tension in the air, one that spread like wildfire through the community they had just begun to embrace. Clara's name, once a whisper of resilience, now echoed through the streets as a headline, a target for judgment and scorn. Jonathan stood before the large window of his mansion, gazing out at the city lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth. His heart was heavy as he thought of Clara, her laughter, her strength, the way her eyes sparkled with hope despite her circumstances. The thought that someone could twist her past into a weapon was unfathomable, yet it was happening. He had seen the headlines, the invasive photographs, and the way the media had portrayed her as a victim of her own making. It made his blood boil, igniting a fierce protectiveness within him. In the days following the scandal, Clara withdrew into herself, a shadow of the vibrant woman he had come to know. She avoided the shelter, opting instead for the solitude of the streets. Jonathan searched for her tirelessly, visiting every corner of the community they had shared, asking the other volunteers if they had seen her. Each rejection felt like a stab to his heart as he imagined her alone, grappling with the weight of her past alone. He couldn't allow her to face this alone. He had to find her. Finally, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the city, Jonathan discovered Clara sitting on a bench in a small park. The air was crisp, and the shadows lengthened around her, creating a cocoon of isolation. She looked smaller than he remembered, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the ground. The sight tore at him. He approached slowly, cautious not to startle her, but his heart raced with the urgency of his emotions. "Clara," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and pain. It was the first time he had seen her since the scandal broke, and the hurt in her gaze struck him like a physical blow. Jonathan took a seat beside her, their silence heavy but charged with unspoken words. He reached for her hand, feeling the coldness of her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth he hoped to share. She flinched at his touch, and he immediately withdrew, searching her face for any sign of the connection they had forged. He could see the turmoil in her expression, the battle between wanting to reach out and the fear of being hurt again. Jonathan knew the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about their burgeoning relationship. This was about her safety, her dignity, her very identity. As night enveloped the park, Jonathan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He needed to confront the associate who had orchestrated this scandal, to turn the tables and protect Clara from further harm. He realized that despite his wealth, it was his influence and connections that could shield her, not isolate her. The thought of using his power for her benefit filled him with a sense of purpose. Clara had shown him the beauty of vulnerability and community. Now it was his turn to stand by her side, to fight for her. They stood together, united in their resolve, as they made their way to confront the associate. Jonathan's heart pounded as they approached the upscale restaurant where he knew the man often dined. The air felt electric, charged with anticipation and fear. Jonathan glanced at Clara, who looked determined yet terrified, and he squeezed her hand reassuringly. They were in this together, and he would not let her face this alone. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was bustling, filled with laughter and clinking glasses, a stark contrast to the gravity of their mission. Jonathan spotted the associate at a table, surrounded by friends, his smug demeanor radiating confidence. As Jonathan approached, he felt Clara's grip tighten around his arm, her anxiety palpable. He turned to her, offering a reassuring nod before stepping forward, confronting the man who had thrown Clara's life into chaos. The confrontation was tense, words exchanged like daggers, cutting through the veneer of civility. Jonathan laid bare the truth, using his influence to expose the associate's ulterior motives. The jealousy that had festered since Jonathan had begun to pursue a life outside of his wealth, a life that included Clara. The associate's bravado faltered as Jonathan's voice rang with authority, and the realization of the truth became evident in the eyes of his companions. Yet, the battle was not just against the associate's words, but against the darker truth that Clara had carried for so long. As Jonathan spoke, her past began to emerge, not as a weapon, but as a testament to her resilience. He spoke of her strength, her ability to rise above tragedy, and the love she had for her family that would never fade, despite what had happened. The tension in the air shifted as Clara found her voice. She spoke of her family, her loss, and the pain that had once rendered her voiceless. With each word, she reclaimed her narrative, transforming it from one of shame to one of courage. The associate's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of uncertainty. As Clara poured out her heart, the restaurant fell silent, the patrons drawn into her story, a tapestry woven with threads of grief and hope. In that moment, Jonathan felt an overwhelming surge of love and admiration for Clara. She was no longer just the woman he had kissed under the twinkling lights. She was a warrior, battling not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by their circumstances. As she finished speaking, the weight of her truth hung in the air, a shield against the lies that had threatened to consume her. The associate, cornered and exposed, faltered. It was then that the police arrived, responding to a tip-off. As they took him into custody, Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Clara's past was no longer a burden. It was a part of her story that had led her to this moment, to him. As they emerged from the restaurant, the night air felt different, lighter. Clara looked up at Jonathan, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as they both breathed in the moment. A moment of victory, of redemption. Together, they stepped into the new year, the promise of a fresh start lingering in the air. Hand in hand, they faced the world, ready to build a future not defined by their pasts but forged through love, resilience, and a shared commitment to each other. The night was filled with the distant sound of fireworks, echoing the joy of new beginnings. In that moment, Jonathan and Clara knew they were no longer alone. They had each other, and together, they would face whatever came next.